And it seems a bit strange to be introducing Catherine Bowie in this venue, since I don't think there's a single person here that probably doesn't know her already. But nevertheless, I'll do it anyway, just in case some of you are not familiar with all the details. And of course, I won't be able to give you all the details because that would take us too much time. And Catherine's well known for making very short talks. So we have to, let the introduction be a little bit longer than normal because, she rarely has a lot to say. But Catherine Bowie is a political anthropologist, and she's a Vilas Distinguished Achievement Professor of Anthropology here at UW-Madison. And as you will all know, she is a specialist in northern Thailand, although I think her talk today is going well beyond northern Thailand. In fact, it may be one of the first talks that we've ever heard from her that doesn't relate to northern Thailand directly. She received her PhD in anthropology from the University of Chicago in 1988. And in the same year, she started as an assistant professor here at UW-Madison, so she's been here ever since then. She has published 6 books. The 2 that are the most famous, I think, or the most worth mentioning are her 1997 book, Rituals of National Loyalty, An Anthropology of the State and the Village Scout Movement in Thailand. And then 20 years later, her book in 2017, Of Beggars and Buddhas, The Politics of Humor in the Vasantra Jataka in Thailand. She has held a number of important positions over the years, including center director, of course, and most notably from a sort of international perspective, was the vice president, past president, and past president of the Association of Asian Studies between 2016 and 2020. And she's published a large number of journal articles, which I will not go into detail about here, but I will tell you that I imagine that the talk that we're hearing, I haven't seen the talk, but I imagine the talk that we're listening today will actually be a combination of a number of different work that she's done on eunuchs, and she's divided it up into different articles in which she's submitted to different journals now and is waiting for those to be reviewed. So we're likely to see a number of articles on the topic that we're hearing about today. And then, of course, now that she's finished with this work and is moving on to the next book, which we're all waiting for, on Kuba Sibichai, which, of course, we've all heard about it for a long, long time. And, she's keeping us in suspense. But in between all this work, she's been most recently got herself interested in harems and eunuchs, and has done not only a study of eunuchs in Thailand, but has looked at all of Southeast Asia and beyond to think about this topic. So I could say a lot more about Catherine, but I'm afraid that she's ready to go. So let's give her a big round of applause. Thank you.
So I will give you a brief, well, I don't know about brief, but I'll give you an introduction to how I got into this topic and an overview of eunuchs across Asia, Southeast Asia, and particularly the Theravada mainland, and raise overall the question of why were there so few eunuchs in Southeast Asia, and I'll consider 3 interrelated factors: Theravada Buddhism, the structure of harems, and matrilineal kinship, and conclude. So by way of introduction, as Ian mentioned, I mainly work in northern Thailand, and there's absolutely no evidence of eunuchs there. So you may be wondering how I stumbled into such a bizarre topic, and it is bizarre. But I trace it back to an election that I saw in the village in the 1990s, when it was an election unlike any of the others that I had seen. Normally, we all knew who was going to be elected village headman. They had been fermenting their rice wine for a month in advance. There were no surprises. This particular election was incredibly distressing. People were losing sleep, there were people crying, it was incredibly tense. So I wanted to know what had changed in these election laws that had made this process so distressing. And as I traced it back to a text, originally the Local Administration Act of 1914, which in turn was based on the Local Administration Edict of 1897. And I was shocked to read that women had the right to vote in local elections that early. So that led to some articles on the role of women in village politics, changes in local election laws, but also an interest in the history of women's suffrage. The person who drafted this law was Prince Damron. So he had grown up in the palace, and I was wondering, why did he include women and give them the right to vote? Was it because he was a proto-feminist? He would have been educated by Presbyterian missionaries who were involved with the Women's Christian Temperance Union, which was a international pro-suffrage movement. So it's possible. I mean, he was definitely exposed to these women and their husbands who were supporters. So was he a proto-feminist, or was he just Thai? That he grew up in the palace, surrounded by women who were in their own right very powerful. The queens were half-sisters of the king. And at the time the law was passed, actually King Chulalongkorn was out of the country, and a queen was serving as regent. So I got interested in court politics and harems and started reading about it, but then I got busy with other things in life. This was like early 2000s. And so then COVID hit. So I was working on Siwijai, on this book manuscript. But it's hard, you know, we were teaching online, learning all this new stuff, and I can't handle a big project and focus. So why don't I just go back to the stuff on harems? I've done a lot of reading on harems. I just, you know, if I have a day free, I can read another book. If I have a half day, I'll read a couple articles. We're good. I'll get this thing whipped out and done by April. So I started reading. I read everything I could get on harems in China, the Mughal Empire, the Ottoman Empire. I'd already read a lot about Southeast Asia harems. And then, because it was COVID, all my students know that I have become obsessed. This is my evening entertainment, which I justify because it's about harems, after all. So I have watched all 100 episodes of Magnificent Century on the Ottoman and, you know, Suleiman and Harem and all of that. The Qin Dynasty, which at least was, you know, historically based, but then everybody knows I'm in love with Chun Ken, Tenquifir, and oh my God, this is an amazing series. But it is fictional. And then I was struck that why weren't there any great palace dramas on India and the Mughal Empire? And it dawned on me that, well, I guess as a Hindu nation these days, they don't want to remember the past. So that's the only one I'm aware of. And then, because I had already gotten into Eunuchs, I was having a lot of fun with Bouquet Saniwat. Anyway, so that's what I've been doing at night. I've been enjoying COVID. I have a new addiction. I'm almost getting fluent in Korean. I wouldn't go that far, but there are a lot of good ones. Anyway, so in Asian history, palace harems intersected kinship and kingship. Although originally an Arabic word used to refer to any forbidden or sacred space, the term harem has come to refer to women's quarters of polygynous rulers. Court polygyny had two major purposes: to strengthen a dynasty's political position in the present and to ensure its future. Countering false assumptions of a divide between public and private spheres, a growing number of studies are exploring the political roles that harem women played in their respective courts. As Keith McMahon noted, he's a China scholar, the state politics of men generally pretended that the sexual politics of women in the palace was completely separate. But sexual politics had an inherent effect on state politics because of the basic fact that every emperor had to have a successor. Eunuchs have long been presumed to be a concomitant feature of historical harems, tasked with guarding and overseeing the sexual purity of court women, primarily because eunuchs wouldn't be able to impregnate them. So this has been, when you read about eunuchs, it's over and over about how they were guarding the palace women. And I could give you various quotes of, so Portuguese adventurer Duarte Barbarossa, writing of Bengal, 1518, they value eunuchs as guardians of their women in the states and for other low objects. And then George Carter Stent, who was a British soldier stationed in China in the 1860s, highlighted the suspicion, distrust, and jealousy of Eastern potentates and others of the fidelity of their wives and concubines, and the dread that if men were employed, licentiousness and profligacy would run riot in their house. So basically the idea is that eunuchs had something to do with guarding harems, and so the two are always connected. So as I'm reading about harems, it is striking me that there were an incredible number of eunuchs. So in the 1626, Portuguese priest Alvaro Semedo estimated that there were some 12,000 eunuchs serving the Chinese court. 12,000 eunuchs. Only 3,000 women was the figure that he gave for the number of women in the harem. So far more eunuchs than even women. And a very long history going way back. So here's one of the earliest portrayals of eunuchs in a temple tomb. Here's Empress Dowager Sisi with eunuchs. She's in the chair, surrounded by the eunuchs. One of the consequences of castration is longer limbs. So you can see the eunuch standing there, and he's significantly taller than the empress or the others. And this is considered the last eunuch. He was castrated three weeks before the Republican overturn of government. So that was an unfortunate complication in his life. The Ottoman Empire, also huge numbers of eunuchs with interesting racial division. Black eunuchs guarding the harem, white eunuchs with the soldiers. The Safavid, some 3,000 eunuchs in the Persian court in the 1660s. And the Mughal Empire also had eunuchs, although they seem to be fewer in number. So, and I want to make sure that people understand what we're talking about. This was not just messing with testicles to produce castrati opera singers, of which there were thousands of young boys whose testicles were damaged in order that they would be opera singers. Asian, it was a radical surgery removing the penis and the testicle. High mortality rate, somewhere between, it depended on where and who and how skilled, but a good 2/3 died. So we are not talking about a simple thing. They typically did young boys around 8 to 10, so before puberty. Vietnam actually it appears to have done more older. So there were specialized gelders, people who specialized this. There were castration centers that developed around the world. So there were centers in Europe, in Italy, France, and Spain, Africa, particularly in Egypt. Bengal was a major castration center with, it looks like specialized training. It looks like Bengali eunuchs were in high demand. China, there were so many people being castrated that there were lots of centers, and the trade was sort of handed from father to son. Vietnam the same, and Java is the other place that I've found appears to have been a castration center. So you couldn't just do it willy-nilly. Now turning to Southeast Asia eunuchs and looking particularly at the Theravada world. Overall, compared to these other Asian countries, Southeast Asia had relatively few eunuchs, but it varied depending on religion, colonization, etc. So just to remind us, Southeast Asia. Non-Theravada, I found no evidence in the Philippines that there, even in the Muslim kingdoms, that there were eunuchs. Vietnam, lots of eunuchs. Indonesia, yes, until about 1699, and then it seems to have disappeared. I suspect Dutch colonization was a factor. No evidence in Malaysia. Theravada countries, Sri Lanka basically no, although I found a 30-year period where it seems that there was a eunuch usurper, but other than that, never. No evidence for Cambodia or Laos. Evidence for Burma, but very low numbers. At the most, we'd be talking perhaps as high as maybe 200. And Siam, yes, also very low numbers. I think the biggest argument you could possibly make would maybe be 200. Vietnam, I find it interesting that eunuchs were so important in the court. In the 1600s, around 500, several of the European travelers mentioned several hundred, so about 500 in the court. And these were very influential people. They were not wasting their time guarding harems. This Li Tuan Kit was a very famous and powerful military general, provincial governor. There are streets named after him to this day. He was a military strategist. Le Van Duet, military general, very important, influential in Vietnam and Cambodia as well. Oversaw the building of this canal. And these are the tombs for some of the royal eunuchs. Even as late as 1925, the Empress Dowager had 70 eunuchs attending to her. So Vietnam has a long history of the use of eunuchs, and surprisingly, almost nothing is written about them. Philippines doesn't seem to have had eunuchs because after 1565, it's oriented much more towards the galleon trade and towards the Atlantic Ocean. And so when you look at the trade routes, you can see the difference in orientation. And you can also start thinking about, how did eunuchs travel, given that there were specialized castration centers. In the Muslim world in Indonesia, Java was a castration center and had hundreds of eunuchs, and Aceh had, depending on the source, somewhere between 100 and 500 eunuchs in its court. The Theravada world had relatively fewer, so Sri Lanka, Cambodia, Laos, no. Burma, yes, Burma had eunuchs. It's possible that there were eunuchs in Pegu already before 1599. I found only one source though. And I'm not sure how reliable it is. He describes the last king murdering 200 eunuchs because he didn't want them to divulge where his riches were hidden. That's the only one source, not confirmed. There were lots of other European travelers to Pegu. Arakan definitely had eunuchs from the 1600s through 1785 when the kingdom was captured by the north, by the Kanban dynasty. So Michael Pellets has suggested that Arakan had produced its own eunuchs. I would argue that Arakan itself, a Theravada Buddhist kingdom, did not engage in castration. There is no evidence that they castrated there. Instead, Arakan controlled Chittagong, the port city of Bengal. And Bengal is definitely known to have been producing large numbers of eunuchs. In fact, they seem to have supplied much of the Mughal Empire. Many of them were actually called Bengala, as a reference to coming from Bengal. So I do not believe that Arakan itself produced eunuchs. I think it's because of the control it had over Chittagong. So Arakan was, oh, and I should also point out that these were very powerful eunuchs. He served as prime minister, minister of war. They oversaw land holdings. They oversaw international trade. They served as international foreign ambassadors. These were very powerful, influential eunuchs. And others appear to have served as palace guards. Not harem guards, but actually guarding the king. In the Kanbang dynasty, Michael Symes and others that visited Amarapura in the late 1700s describe eunuchs, but they were captured from Arakan. And they are described as sort of symbolic gestures of the military power of the victors. So there were about 6 that are described in a palace interview, in a palace audience. There may have been more that weren't at the palace audience, but it's a low number. And I was incredibly excited to find this picture. And you can see the lanky, long limbs of this eunuch in the court of Mandalay, who actually has a name and was evidently very powerful. And I can't tell from looking at this picture, he appears to have gone native, but I haven't found anything that gives me any information about his background other than he was powerful and influential. And not involved in guarding palace women, but rather their servants. So Queen Shinbyum Mashin, I don't speak Burmese, so you guys need to help me out, who's over there on the far left, was the mastermind between the killing of some 80 to 100 Burmese princes and princesses and machinating to make sure that Tiba got the throne, and more importantly, that her daughter, Supayala, got Tiba. So she was machinating to make sure that her daughter got the throne along with Tiba, who was not going to be the obvious heir. And she had eunuchs as her messengers going to the Privy Council at the time of the vote. Supayala had a eunuch involved. Apparently Tiba got interested in another woman, and Supayala took care of that woman and had the eunuch go and at least check to make sure that the girl had been murdered. So eunuchs are not controlling the women, rather the other way around. Evidence of eunuchs in Thailand. Abedeshwazi and others, by the time of the court of King Narai, there are definitely eunuchs. Lubert tells us that there were 6 to 8. So we're not talking about a lot, and we can be comfortable that this is not, he actually gives us a map of his hunting palace, and you can see up at the top, M is the lodging, kitchens and lodgings of the eunuchs. However, I think there were probably more eunuchs in Ayutthaya, because it turns out there's a description of his daughter, Narai's daughter, Yamatei, who is described as having very insolent eunuchs. So there were evidently more than just those attending the king. She apparently had some. And I came across a record from Engelbert Kempfer, who was visiting the Safavid Palace in Isfahan, Iran, and he describes the Siamese envoy with a Negro attendant. And the Siamese envoy is Persian, which suggests to me that many of the Persians who were living in Ayutthaya likely also had eunuchs as their attendants or assistants. And in the Palace Law of Ayutthaya, and there's a volume that our colleague Chris Baker and Pasuk Pongajit have edited and translated, so we can now read it easily. There are references to both Chinese and Muslim eunuchs. So that's rather intriguing. And from this account of the palace, the Ayutthaya palace law, the Chinese eunuchs appear more often with, there are only like a total of 6 references, so more often is a bit presumptuous, but the references with the Chinese eunuchs are with the queens and the women. And the Muslim Indian eunuchs are with the king. Were there eunuchs in Ayutthaya before King Narai? Possible. The Chinese eunuchs would be my guess. And we know that women are involved in trading and women do a lot of the ritual organizing, so they may have coordinated with Chinese eunuchs. And we know that Zheng He came to Ayutthaya. He made 3 trips. So they were certainly familiar with eunuchs. Perhaps somebody was left to oversee Chinese interests. I don't know. But we know that Narai had a thing about Persia and Shah Suleiman. So he is described as already as a young boy enjoying going over to the Persian households. He liked Persian food. He imported sheep to Ayutthaya so that he could have Muslim dishes, little various yummy curries, dressed Persian style, and even had a sword that was Persian style. There were doctors, other staff members in the court that were Persian, although it's hard to know what that means because it seems that many of them came actually, that they were from India as part of the expanded Muslim empire, the Mughal Empire. Interestingly, I mentioned earlier this racial distinction. So in the Ottoman Empire, black eunuchs were with the harem, with the women, and the white eunuchs were with the soldiers. In the Safavid court, it was the reverse. Only black eunuchs could guard the king. So the fact that the black eunuchs are guarding Narai makes me think that this is more influenced from Safavid than Ottoman. And so then we would have to start thinking through the slave trade. When did eunuchs end in Ayutthaya? I forgot to mention that in Burma, that they go all the way up through the present, not the present, but through British colonial rule. And I think the court found it very useful to use these Arakanese eunuchs and sent them back to Arakan to help administer the Arakan province. When did eunuchs end in Ayutthaya? Well, we could go with the date of 1688, when Petraja overthrows King Narai. And maybe he would have looked at all of Narai's eunuchs and gone, don't trust these guys, let's get rid of them. That's a possibility. Petraja marries Yomate, Narai's daughter. But she was kind of a difficult woman to have as a wife, since she plotted 2 revolts against him. So it's possible that he may have decided to curtail her powers by eliminating her eunuchs. That's a possibility. So we got 1700, 1709. She dies in 1736. Maybe that's a good time to get rid of eunuchs. 1767, end of Ayutthaya. Maybe all of the eunuchs were taken back to Burma. Who knows? 1753, there's a record that the Siamese court was requesting eunuchs from China, which was not granted. They were to come and help develop court rituals. So many people are in print, including distinguished colleagues like Craig Reynolds, saying there were no eunuchs in the Thai court. Well, I just read and then I reread, and I happen to reread Anna Leon Owens. And she was governess in the court from 1862 to 67, and she writes, quote, "The priests are escorted to the pavilion," this is coming into the palace, and 2 warriors armed with swords and clubs remained on guard till the services ended. The latter, who are eunuchs, also attended the priests when they entered the palace in the afternoon to sprinkle the inmates with consecrated water. I place a fair amount of credibility in this because Anna Leon Owens had a thing about women. She was very active in the women's suffrage movement, but she does not have a history of agitating on behalf of eunuchs. So to me, this is she's just describing what she saw with no particular agenda. So I place credibility in this account that there were, in fact, eunuchs in the Bangkok court. And what they were doing, how many, no idea. Overall, so then, we can say that there were, compared to China, where you've got 13,000 eunuchs and only 3,000 women, or is it 60? Yeah, 12,000 eunuchs and 3,000 women, and elsewhere across Asia. Overall, Southeast Asia had very few eunuchs. Why? What was the possible role of religion, particularly Theravada Buddhism, the harem structure, and matrilineal kinship? So we can think about Buddhist ordination rules. So in the process of ordination, a candidate is asked a series of 13 questions, and Venerable Suppiah will confirm. So in addition to asking a candidate if they have their parents' permission to ordain, verifying they're not a slave or a government servant, there are a series of questions about their physical condition. So they can't have leprosy, boils, eczema, tuberculosis, epilepsy, etc. Questions number 6 and 7 respectively ask, are you a human being and are you a man? And it goes on. I mean, you can't have any physical deformities. Missing hands, feet, ears, nose, eyes, anything. So if you were castrated, it would have been very difficult to find a preceptor who would be willing to ordain you. Furthermore, ordination is a major rite of passage for all village youths in the old days. If you weren't ordained, you were a raw person in Thailand. And this is where you learned important life skills, like how to build a house. You learned carpentry, wood carving, mural painting, literacy, all the things that you needed to become a village leader. So ordination was very important. And women could not ordain as monks. So the only way for a woman to get merit, aside from her own acts, an important way is to have her son ordained and him dedicating the merit from his ordination to his mother. So women in particular would have had a vested interest in not having men, their sons, castrated. And Southeast Asian men had other things they liked to do with their penises. So there are accounts going back into the 1500s, Ralph Fitch and others, of men inserting rubies into their penises. And I thought it was wonderful that the reason they were doing this was because they thought it would bring women greater pleasure. So I thought, wonderful. And then we've got all of the various amulets and things that are related to celebrating penises. So if Theravada Buddhism is a factor, is it an important factor? Because overall, besides the Theravada nations, we also saw that overall there were few eunuchs. So let's look at harem structure and matrilineal kinship. Well, one might think that harems in Southeast Asia were smaller than the Chinese harems, or the Mughal, or the Ottoman, or the Safavid. But no, Bodhapaya had 200 wives, 120 kids. King Mindon, 62 wives, 110 children. Mingmang, 43 wives, 142 children. Chula, the count varies just how many, but 54 wives, 97 children. So Southeast Asia had significant harems, and the Bangkok harem is typically assessed at about 3,000 women. Harems are typically portrayed as women representing women's subjugation. they're just there for the sexual pleasure of the men. And so you get European portraiture like this, where the harem women are just sexual playthings. Men's fantasies here. So I got interested then in trying to understand what is going on in the harem. And I don't have time to get into this whole breakdown, but let me just sort of highlight. Chinese preferred consorts were commoners. They had already had like elite intermarriages, and then the concubine consorts family started getting involved in politics, and they start screwing up stuff in court, and so they decided enough of that. They had a general draft. Thousands of women brought in, and then we'd go through this screening. They'd eliminate the first, 1,000 and the next 1,000, and then, even checking how the sweat under their armpit smelled. And then the sweetest smelling and the smart, it would be, in the end there'd be about 50 that would be selected to actually enter and remain in the palace. The Ottomans also, I would have thought that they would want to marry good Muslim families. But no, the Ottoman preferred wives were captured Christian slaves. Coming into the palace, absolutely powerless. No family contacts to be able to interfere in court politics. The Mughal is different. The early marriages were with first cousins. And the Theravada courts with half-sisters. So very different patterns, and it's interesting that, harems have always just been seen as harems, but when you start looking at them and comparing them, there are really interesting differences. The empress in the Chinese courts was kept as weak as possible, often not even named empress until after she died. In the Ottoman, it was the Valida Sultan who was the very powerful woman, so the mother of the Sultan. Mughal, because it was first cousins and bilateral kinship, the most powerful woman, the Pasha Begum, were aunts, sisters, wives, daughters. It was a range of kinship relations to the ruler. And in the Theravada, queens were sisters, wives, and daughters of the predecessor. And the selection of heirs, Chinese, they wanted at certain periods rulers who were good in military operations, so you had to be able to prove your skills. So they wouldn't designate a young boy as crown prince. They would want, so it typically went from one brother to the next brother, and then of course there were always disputes. So then they tried various things, naming a crown prince. They had secret succession. Succession was just always a problem, as I know from watching all these palace dramas. Yes. The Ottomans, they actually had a law of fratricide recommending that in order to eliminate strife, whoever wins should eliminate all the competition. So the one ruler killed his 19 younger brothers. Just amazing, even though one was like a 6-month-old baby. And in the end, they actually confined, oh my God, I'm running out of time, confined all the princesses into a part of the palace where they were guarded by eunuchs and couldn't get out. And they were given concubines so they could have some fun, but they made sure that the concubines were sterile. So these were then sultan, when they took the throne, they had no heirs because they had been maintained in this, and they also had not much experience. The Mughals do a similar pattern. They had these factions and they were all fighting each other, blah, blah, blah. And so they also confined the princesses so that, they're stuck there. Theravada, one of the outlets would be ordination, political strife. But there really were no, ordination, they also had second kings, and they had a privy council that would elect the successor. So that kept some of the conflict to a minimum. Control over sexuality. The Chinese court, the rulers were told that they had to have heirs but every time they ejaculated, they were shortening their lives. So, you know, it takes a lot of the fun out of it. The Ottomans had a one mother, one son rule. If a concubine had one son, that was it. She could no longer sleep with the ruler. Mughals, you could be a powerful woman and not have a son. You could adopt, but you didn't even need to do that. You could just be powerful because you were powerful. Sexuality of Theravada princes, unrestrained. I mean, they were just producing like rabbits. You know, lots of wives, lots of princes. In general, princesses across this were all less likely to marry. The Chinese had their, oh, I don't have time to go into, anyway. So ordination was a refuge. You could ordain, as King Mongkut did, and avoid conflict. Palaces, harems are typically been described as patrilocal. Everybody has, lots of people, oh, isn't it amazing, you know, the villages are matrilocal, but then there's the palace. That's obviously patrilocal. Actually, no. The king is living there with his half-sisters who are daughters of his father. It's a, you can easily argue that it's a matrilocal system. And if you look at it, the case of usurpation, like Petraja, in order to establish his legitimacy, he marries Narai's wife and daughter. So he's marrying into the palace. And when you start to really look carefully at a lot of, if more people were doing, by tracing politics through the women, so the Burmese had this Tebendang pattern, where they would name a daughter who was to become the wife of the next ruler. So it was her position, not the crown prince, but as the queen-to-be, that established the legitimacy. In her case, she had bad luck. She was supposed to marry the Tiba and did it and took the throne instead. And when you start to analyze the Siamese harem, there's all this talk about, oh, the women were hostages for the good behavior of their fathers. They were sent to court. Well, no, actually, out of the 154 concubines or consorts of Chula, only 3 were from tributary states. The majority were half-sisters, the daughters of the predecessor, aunts, nieces, a huge female network with daughters of Chinese and some of the families where the father had been sent as a governor of a province. And here is the Burmese court and audience, and you can see both the king and the queen are at the audience. These women were powerful, running businesses, owning land, charging interest, trading internationally. I've got some funny quotes which I don't have time of people talking about how powerful the women are. Never mind. So Yamateb, when you read through these records carefully, there were women who are running the economy. So all of the products that are being traded internationally, forest products that are coming from upcountry, et cetera, the merchants, the traders that are making all of this happen are overwhelmingly women. And so they link then with the women in the palace. Southeast Asian Theravada courts were not guarded by eunuchs. They were guarded by female Amazons. And that was true in Aceh as well. So why so few eunuchs? Theravada Buddhism? Not so much. I think religion is a language of debate. You know, Muhammad said you're not supposed to castrate. So you know, they decided not to castrate Muslims, but that didn't stop them from castrating others. The Confucians have an injunction to honor your parents. You should take care of your body. That didn't stop them from castrating in the thousands and thousands. Christianity, well, actually what Jesus said is a little ambiguous. And Europeans turned thousands of boys into castrati. So I don't see religion as the primary factor. Looking at matrilineality, matrilocality, so men marrying into the woman's village, agricultural land is passed down through the woman and her family. The youngest daughter typically receives extra inheritance for the responsibility of taking care of the parents. Women are independently responsible for financial matters. They have a strong nexus of support because they're surrounded by their female relatives. And even in cases of divorce, women have a right to keep property that they brought into the marriage. So women active in the markets, in the economy, organizing the labor groups that plant the fields, organizing all of the rituals that are being done. And even in contemporary politics, you can't understand it without understanding women's networks. So I'm arguing that these kingdoms were linked through matrilineal networks from the villages to the palace, linking up country. And here you can see patrilocality and the societies that are in green, matrilocal. And you can see that generally Southeast Asia is dramatically matrilocal. So let me just conclude. I have, as Ian was saying, pulling together different things here. The shared prevalence of matrilineality across Southeast Asia suggests it was indeed an important factor which underlay the broader relative absence of eunuchs. Anthropologists have described Southeast Asian societies as almost all matricentric. Even the Islamic societies, such as the Javanese and the Minangkabau, fit the matricentric pattern. So as one of the anthropologists writes that even though their religious systems diffused from the Middle Old World, the social structural pattern remained matricentric. And so we can consider the kingdoms of Patani, where they had 4 queens ruling in succession. Aceh, also a series of queens ruling. That harems could be policed by women challenges the presumption that eunuchs were a necessary component of harems. However, the question remains of why Southeast Asian kingdoms included eunuchs at all. That the number of eunuchs grew most significantly in the 17th century, not just in the Theravada Buddhist kingdoms, but across Southeast Asia and beyond, suggests their importance in international trade as symbols of cosmopolitanism or as administrators, drawing upon specialized training in court etiquette, languages, or military arts. The focus on harems has turned attention away from understanding the reasons castrated males were preferable to uncastrated males in roles as military commanders, revenue connectors, court ministers, provincial governors, and even foreign ambassadors. Thus, the relative absence of eunuchs in the Theravada Buddhist courts invites a renewed engagement not only with the general absence from matrilineally oriented courts of Southeast Asian kingdoms, but also with their extraordinary presence in the patrilineal courts of the Chinese, Ottoman, Persian, and Mughal empires. And so I just wanted you to just see this overlay. So matrilocal, and you can see where this castration is taking place. And so I suggest that when we are studying the absence of something, the relative absence, it also raises interesting questions about the presence from a different perspective. So by studying eunuchs and recognizing their relative absence in Southeast Asia, it led me to a new consideration of the structure of harems across Asia. Okay.
Very good.